And on behalf of our Board of Trustees and the entire staff of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, it is my honor to welcome you here today. To start our program, I ask that in honor of our men and women in uniform, you please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Please be seated. See, I know there's a couple of members of the debate team who are joining us from out of state, and I just wanted to apologize for our terrible California winters. I hope you brought a light sweater. It's supposed to be 65 and sunny today, so. I want to take a minute to recognize and thank our guest judges today. We have two wonderful guest judges. First, one of our good friends and an amazing educator from the Simi Valley Unified School District, the Director of Elementary Education, Miss Kathy Roth. Thank you very much. And from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, you saw in our video there, we award more than $1 million through various scholarship programs and competitions and that sort of thing. And the man who is judging today is the person who signs those checks, our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Jerry Zuck. Those of you who are good at math will note that if we have two judges and they vote differently, that's a tie. So how are we going to determine who the ultimate victor in this debate is? Well, the third judge is going to be you, the members of the audience. So at the end of the debate, if you have a smartphone or cell phone, we're going to bring up a website, and it'll ask you to text a certain code in, and so the audience will determine the third vote in today's competition. So be listening very carefully. President Reagan would have been very excited to know that the USA debate team, comprised of our nation's most outstanding young communicators, was here at his library staging this showcase today. And there are a couple of reasons why this is such a great place to have a showcase. President Reagan, as you probably know or may have heard, his nickname was the Great Communicator. And he said, "I've always believed that a lot of the troubles in the world would disappear if we were talking to each other instead of about each other." And communication really means having something to say and then the manner in which it's done. And you'll see some really people who have a lot to say and know the great way to do it today. You know, we live in a world now where effective communication is more important than ever. When Ronald Reagan was the president, the personal computer industry was just getting started. And I'm guessing most of you in the audience today don't even have personal computers. I know I have a daughter who's in 7th grade, and the only thing she uses is her phone. Doesn't use a computer. Like sitting in front of a screen larger than this is scary to her, I think. So she's constantly on that phone. And when he was the president, the height of communication technology was something called the fax machine. Does anybody raise your hand if you're younger? Does anybody know what the fax machine is? Have you ever used it? A couple of you know what that is. You've seen them in a museum, or it holds the door open on a windy day or something like that? Yeah. So now people can drive headlines around the globe and impact global financial markets with 140 characters or less on Twitter. So communication has changed quite a bit in the last couple of decades here. And the ability to communicate effectively and powerfully is absolutely essential. So to illustrate this, I want to share one of Ronald Reagan's favorite stories on communication. And this is a story that was told to him by a man named Denny Villanueva, who was a kicker for the Los Angeles Rams, which, just for those of you who are football fans, there was a Los Angeles Rams during Ronald Reagan's time, then they moved away for a long time, and then they just came back this past year. So it seems like it's more recent than it actually was. But Danny said that one night he was having dinner at the house of one of the Dodgers ball players, a young ball player who had a young wife, and they just had a baby. And the baby started to cry while the gentlemen were talking about sports. And so the wife was getting dinner ready, and she kind of called over her shoulder to her husband, the baseball player, "I need you to change the baby." And he was embarrassed, and he was kind of young, and being there talking with this former NFL great, he said, "What do you mean change the baby? I'm a ball player. That's not my line of work." So she turned around, and she put her hands on her hips, and she communicated with him. And she said, "Look, Buster, you lay the diamond out like a diaper. You put second base on home plate. You put the baby's bottom on the pitcher's mound. You hook up first and third, and you slide home underneath. And if it starts to rain, the game ain't over. You just start right over again." So today's topic is it's a little bit more serious than changing diapers, though I would imagine that this group could put on quite a show and make us all re-examine our thoughts on proper diaper changing technique if given a couple of minutes of prep time. President Reagan envisioned his library as being a place that would continue to discuss the ideas that played an important role in his presidency. Things like, as he said, what kind of government should we have? How much government is too much government? How best to expand the frontiers of freedom around the world? How best to help those who seem to have lost hope? How to achieve our national destiny? And the truth is that civil discourse in this country has often ceased to be both civil and discourse. Debate in the public sphere is often no longer an exchange of ideas, but an exchange of insults. And if you spend any time on your phone or on your personal computer or on your fax machine, looking at the comment section on any internet news site, you'll know that what I'm saying is absolutely true. So in times like this, where do we turn for effective communication examples? Where can we see the power of powerful communication in action? Well, you're lucky because you're in the right place at the right time to see a great example of what effective communication looks like. And that's the members of Team USA who are going to show us how to do it right today. So today, the topic that they will be debating is, as quote, "This House believes that the school choice movement jeopardizes civil rights." And so I'm going to invite up to the stage to explain a little bit more about the format and invite the team members, the coach, and from the great state of Texas, Miss Cindy Timmons.
Good morning. Ronald Reagan was the first president I was able to vote for, and so it's always an honor to return to this library and to also share the members of the national debate team of our country with you. Our team is sponsored by the National Speech and Debate Association, and this is the group of 9 students who represent you both domestically and around the world in international debate competition. Coaching our team, besides myself, is Erin Timmons on the front row, Shane Stafford on the front row also, and Dr. Sandy Berkowitz, who could not be with us. In this format, you will have 2 teams, the proposition defending the motion, which you heard, and the opposition refuting. There are 8-minute constructive speeches with 2 4-minute replies. During the constructive speeches, the first 6 speeches that you see, debaters from the other team may interrupt somebody while they're speaking by offering a point of information. The speaker may choose to accept that point of information, deny the point of information, or ask the opposition to wait just a moment while they finish their thoughts. So don't be surprised if you see people from the other team standing up, trying to interrupt. That's part of the format. Also, in this international format, we tend to clap by tapping the table, or your chair, for example, or your knee as a form of applause. This is the international standard for what we do. The national organization has been around since 1925 and really leads the world in terms of introducing speech and debate activities. There is also, I see many of you are middle school students, there is a National Junior Forensic League, which is under that national umbrella. If you have any questions about that organization, you can ask us after the debate. So I will now introduce the team members to you, and they will then come on stage and get ready for your debates. So on team proposition, we are opening with Nikhil Ramaswamy, a junior from Texas. Then the second speaker for that team is Ellie Grossman, a senior from Minnesota. The third speaker for that team is Liz Yount from here in Los Angeles. Liz is a senior, and she was on the team last year as well. Nikhil was also on the team last year as a sophomore. And then the fourth member of that team is from Houston, Texas, Colette Faulkner. Now, when we debate internationally, it's teams of 3 against teams of 3, but because we want to let you meet as many of our debaters as possible, the fourth speech is done by a different speaker. But when we do this internationally, one of the first 3 would repeat and then stand up to give that last speech. On team opposition, we begin with Josh May from both New Mexico and Colorado. He's senior. Josh is a returning member. Josh and Liz both represented our country as 2 of the 5 students at the World Championship in Germany this past year. And then second speaker for that team is Aditya Dar, senior from San Jose, Our third speaker is also from Los Angeles, Ella Michaels, a junior. And finally, closing that debate will be Gaurav Gawankar from Houston, Texas. Gaurav is a senior. One final thought before we begin the debate. Democracy depends on two things: an informed citizenry and the ability to discuss ideas that are in opposition civilly. And we hope that we model that for you today. We begin with there's a moderator who will call the speakers to stand, and so we will begin with the first speaker for the government. Here, here.
Before we begin the debate, I'd like to extend a huge thank you on behalf of the USA debate team to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library Foundation, Anthony Penney, the director of the Walter and Leonore Annenberg Presidential Learning Center, Whitney Pagan, the education program coordinator at the Reagan Library Foundation, of course, all the staff at Reagan Library, and finally, the National Speech and Debate Association for their sponsorship for this event. We really thank you for the opportunity to debate such a timely, relevant issue for all of you today. With that, let us begin. President Ronald Reagan once said that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Although he believed in limited government, he also understood fundamentally that it was our job as Americans to fight for the rights of our future generations so that no one is left behind. But on the side proposition, what we understand is that the school choice movement returns us to an age of inequality, an age of imbalance, and an age of separation that threatens to topple the educational civil rights movement that began so many years ago. It's because we believe that education is a right for all and not a privilege for few that we propose today's motion, that this House believes that the school choice movement jeopardizes civil rights. In this speech, I'll be doing three things. First, I'll be going over some definitions to clarify the round. Then I'll be going over some framing to provide a lens to view the round, before finally introducing the first two substantive arguments for side proposition, which are that the school choice movement is inherently inequitable, and second, that school choice is inherently inaccessible. But before we get into that, I'd like to offer a few definitions. Our first definition is about what the school choice movement actually is. We would define that as the ability for a student to decide to leave his or her own neighborhood school, which is often assigned through zoning, in favor of educational alternatives that would take the student and his or her funding out of the district school system. Such alternatives encompass charter schools, private schools, voucher programs, as well as magnet schools. But the second definition that we offer you is the idea of civil rights. Since this round is conducted in the context of education, we believe that the civil rights issue should be viewed under education, which we define as the right of every single person to receive an equitable, accessible, and quality education as guaranteed by the government. For example, this would include the right of students with disabilities to receive adequate access to education, regardless of social location. The second thing I'm going to do is go on to framing, and we believe that the framing for this debate takes place on two levels. First of all, we believe that this debate isn't really about the merits of the school choice movement compared to public schools, but instead it's really about how the existence of such a school choice movement directly impacts the goals of the civil rights movement that were previously outlined, at least with an educational context. But second of all, what we tell you under framing is that while we acknowledge that there are vast differences between school choice across the country due to geographic, financial, and social diversity, we believe that the unifying feature from which we derive most of our arguments is the fact that a lot of these options are not beholden to the same regulations and standards as regular public schools. With that, let's go into the first two substantive arguments for the proposition team. Our first substantive argument is that charter schools are inherently inequitable, essentially because school choice movements do the exact same thing. And we have two layers under this. First of all, the idea that education is a public good to which all students ought to have access. When other alternatives to public schools exist and can dodge public enforcement that usually apply to traditional public schools, we say that that makes them publicly funded but not held to the same standards for education and teaching. When these other options are able to parade under the veneer of being a public good while acting as private institutions, we believe that it is principally wrong and violates the ability for all students to access education equitably, a core principle of the civil rights movement with regards to education. Consider charter schools in particular. What we tell you is that charter schools uniquely market to parents. And the reasoning why is because parents are largely influential in determining where their kids go to school. When charter schools make it apparent to parents that they should try and transfer their kids away from public schools towards charter schools and private schools, then what we say is that that decreases funding for public schools because the funds are attached to the students and are taken out of the public education system. This creates huge pockets of inequity that undermine the civil rights movement. For example, we need only look at the example of Pittsburgh, which caused a financial drain for their school district of $53 million a year when funds were diverted from public schools towards charter schools and private schools because they were marketing towards kids to transfer out of those schools. That budgetary trade-off causes the public schools to close, cut programs' quality, and ultimately cut quality of education overall. But before I go on, a point.
Doesn't the fact that so many people were transferring out of the public school system say something about the quality of education that they were receiving there?
Ella, I don't think it's okay for you to say a big generalization about the quality of education that might exist in these other alternatives. What we would tell you on side proposition is two things. First of all, that the quality of education in these charter schools and private schools, first of all, isn't as uniquely accessible to all of these kids who need it the most, but second of all, that if anything, it undermines the quality of education in the public schools because funds are taken out of those schools as children leave those schools to go to private and charter schools. But the second example that we give you is under voucher programs, which essentially increase segregation and inequality in three ways. First of all, we tell you that people tend to self-segregate. The essential idea behind this is that students pick schools that they want to apply to that center around the demographic that they identify with. But furthermore, what we would argue is that traditional white families with more money on average tend to accept vouchers, but even though they don't cover full tuition, they are uniquely advantaged because they have money to compensate for the cost that private schools want them to pay. But second of all, what we tell you is that this idea of white flight uniquely makes these voucher programs extremely segregational. What we tell you is that the people flee public schools that are more racially diverse for more racially homogenous private schools, and that creates segregation in public schools that they never really asked for. But finally, we would tell you that private schools have the unique ability to pick and choose students, where public schools aren't beholden to those same standards because they actually have regulations in place by the state government to prevent them from precluding others from an equal access to education. Our second substantive argument is essentially this idea that school choice options are inherently inaccessible. And there are three layers of analysis here. Our first layer of analysis is that the application process for a lot of these alternative methods of education is inaccessible. What we would tell you is, going with the example of charter schools, is that they try to skirt lottery selection by actually weeding out candidates through stringent application processes to get rid of candidates that they don't actually want in their schools. A primary example of this was actually in New Orleans, Louisiana, where as many as 1/3 of all charter schools were found to do so by the Educational Research Alliance at Tulane University, where those schools encouraged transfers, would not report open slots in their own schools, and only marketed those schools through invitation-only events. That uniquely made them inaccessible application-wise. But the second layer of analysis that we bring to you is this idea that, well, these school choice options are not actually accessible because the actual school isn't accessible. And there are two reasons for this. First of all, the enrollment process isn't accessible very well because what we tell you is that charter schools and private schools have the unique authority in picking the student body, profiting off of segregation. But second of all, what we tell you is that transportation is uniquely a problem. Charter schools and private schools do not provide adequate transportation services for their schools. Why? Because they want to cut costs as much as possible. That means that the low-income working parents that cannot afford transportation can't send their kids to school, even if they do get accepted. But the third layer of analysis that we tell you is the idea that even if they do provide this example of transportation, education itself isn't accessible, because these students would be stuck in a system that is not willing to help them, that undermines civil rights. At the end of the day, it is because the proposition team fundamentally believes that education is a right for all and never a privilege for a few that you need to stand with us and propose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for the first speaker for the opposition.
Fighting for freedom does not look like sitting around and waiting for our schools to change. It does not look like praying that a legislature that's been historically unable to aid marginalized people to suddenly wake up and be able to do it for us. Fighting for freedom looks like standing up every day, designing schools, curriculums, and communities wherein people can succeed. That's what fighting for freedom looks like. That's what we stand for. Under their fantasy land, we hear the somehow idea that we're going to get a perfect public school somewhere in the future. We say we ought not let perfection be the enemy of progress, that we ought to stand and save students, not the system. That's why we're opposing. What I'm going to do in today's speech is rather simple. First, I'm going to go over some issues of framing that we felt didn't get quite enough addressing in First Government. Second, I'm going to offer 2 questions in rebuttal to the substantive material that we've heard thus far. And third, I'm going to offer the first 2 substantive arguments for the proposition: that school choice is a prerequisite for progress on civil rights, and second, that school choice provides unique solutions to unique problems within education. But first, let's talk about this issue of framing. We say, what does it mean for something to undermine those civil rights, specifically within the education context that they talk about, things like equity, access, and quality? We say oftentimes there are barriers that prevent us from getting these equal access to it. We say these are all often along the lines of race, income, and learning disabilities. We say that school choice allows us unique avenues by which to address each one of these barriers, and that's one of the reasons that we prefer it. So now, from that, what does our world look like? We say it's one where you have schools that are often held to the same standards that the traditional public schools are talking about but they have unique opportunities within curriculum and management to do it. They're checked up upon over time so that you're actually able to ensure that they're following these unique standards. And one of the reasons they have a lot of their evidence is because of those audits. We tell you furthermore, what does our world look like? Those worlds compete. So you can have charter schools, you can have vouchers to private schools, and you can have your traditional public schools. Students and parents and communities can then decide which ones best suit their students, and students go to the school that best suits them. We think the world that they have to defend is one where you're zoned to a certain school in a school district, and you don't get that choice, you don't get the ability to choose the freedom to what's best for you, for your student. Those are the sorts of things that we think are problematic. So now how do we weigh these 2 different worlds? Which one is ultimately going to be better? We say it's not just about isolated incidents and tragedies. We think we need to look at how mechanistically charter schools and school choice functions within a larger area of education, and compare students to how they would normally work within a traditional public school wherein they were zoned. That, I think, is the comparative that has to be going on throughout this debate. So now 2 questions specifically in relation and 2 questions to what we heard thus far. First, which side best promotes equity? Hint, it's the one that gives them access to an education for them. Second, which one is more accessible? Hint, it's the one that gives them the ability to go to a school they're not zoned to. But first, a point.
It is not enough to only talk about the students that benefit from school choice. You need to engage with the fact about the students that are left behind in public schools and suffering more under your world.
First of all, we're going to tell you the students that are often taken up are those who are left behind by public schools. Second of all, we're going to tell you that oftentimes you're not able to get change in public schools without specific access to charter schools that pioneer those curricula first. Those are the sorts of things that only happen in a world where you have diverse competition in communities and curricula. That's the world of the opposition. So now, on to that first question about which side best promotes equity. We tell you, we hear over here that education is a public good. We agree. We're actually going to go one step farther. Not just having an education, but having an education specifically tailored to you and to your community ought to be a public good. We think that the way they can't get this is because whenever you have a curriculum designed for students, you're automatically going to be better in our world because you're actually able to choose what's best for you. They tell you, oh, funds are transferred from these schools. And we say, yes, funds go with students. This is the key. And in fact, Ella gives a point example about the fact that you're not getting an education that's designed to be a high-quality curricula for you because these students are leaving. They say we can't make broad generalizations. We think the students are perfectly capable of making that choice for us. On a more principled level, we'd say that these issues like segregatory policies they talk about are the same that they could use to criticize historically black colleges. The reason these are segregatory in their minds is because they actually provide a better curricula for the students who have historically suffered under systems of public schools. The second question on access now, about which is more accessible, we say the comparative that they have to defend is one to which they're zoned to a certain school and can never leave. They have absolutely no room to stand on in this debate because what they're defending is one where there's no access to a curriculum that is designed for you. So now we're going to move on to the first piece of substantive material specifically for the opposition, that school choice is a prerequisite to progress on civil rights. We say the primary barrier are things like segregation. Go back to the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. We say when you're looking at separate, it can never be equal. So we want to evaluate those two components in either world. Under their world, where we have a public school, you have segregation along geographic lines due to processes of redlining and white flight that have made it so that the public school you're zoned to is rarely fully integrated. We say you have different segregation along the lines of wealth because public schools who perform well, the ones where you actually do get curricula designed for students, are almost entirely in areas with wealthy real estate that are really expensive and the majority of marginalized populations can't access. And we say thirdly, along the lines of representation, the people who make decisions about public education within the legislatures are most often white, wealthy, and male. They are not likely to understand the troubles faced by a marginalized population within the public school system, and so they're thus unable to provide the actual solutions that need to go into it. The comparative then, our world, is one where you can use a voucher to go to a private school designed specifically for students like you. It's one where you can create a charter school within your community so that you have a curriculum that benefits particularly you. We think you are able to escape this, and this is why we bring up subjects like historically black colleges. Just on a principled level, you should be able to escape to a school designed for you. You have the right to that freedom of choice. But now secondly, we're going to discuss this issue of unique solutions to unique problems within education. We tell you because you're able to design and choose a curriculum that best suits you, you're able to come up with ones that are more innovative, more individualized. This provides unique learning outcomes outside of just the principle that you ought to have a freedom of choice. It actually creates better education specifically for people who never would have had it before. For example, charter schools that design curriculums specifically around English language learners benefit significantly. Why? Because now you're not just having some public school support, you actually get a curriculum designed fully for you. So these students statistically get 50 more days of reading education and 43 more days in math education equivalents. In fact, a Stanford study, that same one from 2013, shows that the students who benefit most in these kinds of curriculums are those from historically marginalized communities, those who are impoverished, have learning disabilities, come from African American or Hispanic communities. Those are the people who are lifted up when you give them a choice to an education which is best for them. Those are the people who are historically walled off within public schools. Because we think civil rights is about more than just sitting around and waiting for a legislature to recognize your rights. It's about breaking down the barriers between students and education that is designed for them, the walls that keep them trapped in schools that were designed to discriminate them. That's why we said that we ought to stand with students, not with schools in the system. Mr. Speaker, Madam Chair, what we ask you is simple: tear down the walls between education and students who deserve it.
Thank you for those impassioned remarks. Okay, we'll now move to the second speaker for the government, please.
The opposition essentially gets up here and advocates for a school system wherein some students might get a more equitable form of education, but thousands are left languishing on wait lists for charter schools or simply denied from private schools. Essentially, it's the scholastic version of Animal Farm, wherein all students are equal, but some are more equal than others. A few things in this speech. First, I'll go over the framing. Second, I'll go down their case, and then third, I'll rebuild ours, and finally, I will introduce our third substantive argument about how school choice erodes quality. But let's begin with the framing. First, a point of clarification. The proposition does not believe that the entire school choice movement, or everyone within it, is evil. Rather, we believe that, unfortunately, the diamonds in the rough are drowned out by the voices surrounding them, pushing for profit. But furthermore, Josh tells you that what we should be doing is designing an education that means more children will succeed. But there's nothing that says the proposition can't advocate for reform. Rather, we'd say that the majority of the school choice movement distracts from reform opportunities in the public school system. But furthermore, we can't just focus on the comparative for two reasons. First of all, because this debate isn't just about quality, it's about equity and access. But furthermore, if only some students can access this supposedly superior situation, it's separate and it's not equal. That's inherently inequitable and undermines civil rights. But finally, we would say as a point of morality, it's inherently wrong to give public dollars to something only a few children can access and the rest are systemically denied. But with that, let's go down their case. Now, the first thing Josh tells you is that, well, these schools are held to the same standards, but that's patently false. Charter schools aren't held to the same regulations, and private schools are, well, private. But furthermore, Josh tells you, well, the fact that audits are working shows you that these schools are held to the same standards. But let's look what actually happens when these audits exist. For example, two schools in Los Angeles, two charter schools, heard of a draft of an audit they thought they were about to get slapped with, so they closed down without any warning, forcing their students to flood public schools, undermining their education and the education in those overwhelmed schools as well. But furthermore, they assert that children can choose a school that suits them. That's not true at the level where we show you that schools really end up choosing children. But the first substantive they give you is that this is a prerequisite to progress. But a few problems. First of all, they give you this argument about segregation by geography, but Josh completely ignores that we tell you that children don't have access to schools outside their neighborhoods. For example, in Florida, they just ruled that charter schools are not required to provide transportation for their students, and in private schools, this transportation is often completely unaffordable. But furthermore, it's just false that students with vouchers can go to any school at the level where a lot of private schools are thousands and thousands of dollars, and the average voucher is less than $1,000. At that level, students who are closer to the middle class, often white families, are more likely to get accepted with vouchers because they'll need less financial aid in the long run. But the second thing that Josh tries to tell you is that they provide a unique solution. First of all, curriculum is not tailored to students because the majority of boards in private schools and the majority of boards or charter schools are not represented by members of the community, but management teams. On the other hand, public school boards are by locally elected officials. That's much more representative. But second, we find it kind of funny that he wants to address English language learners, given that charter schools suspend and expel them at twice the rate of their white counterparts. They also suspend Native Americans at twice the rate of their white counterparts, Latino students at 1.5 times that rate, and black students at 4 times that rate. At that level, we'd say this isn't a unique solution to a unique problem. It's a unique multiplier to a unique problem. But now, let's look at some of the responses that they make on our case.
Ellie.
First of all, they tell you that, well, this education is tailored to you. But what's true is that on, for example, charter school boards, the only ones that tend to have members of the community, such as parents, are those schools that are majority white. At that level, the only communities with autonomy in their education are wealthier white ones. We find that problematic, but you disagree.
Okay, look, we absolutely agree that the fact that minorities are targeted more than white students is a huge problem, but that's a problem with entrenched racial biases within society. It's not one unique to the school choice movement. We need to address those problems, but this is not the root cause.
Well, Ella, at the level where these schools express these biases at a higher level than they do in public schools, we find that uniquely problematic. I would not tell a child whose education has been stolen from them, who is 5 times more likely to drop out than their counterparts, whose 10 times more likely to get into the juvenile justice system, that we shouldn't address that problem because, well, it's simply entrenched. We would say we should go with the system that's less likely to send kids to prison. But the second thing they tell you is that, well, we're providing choice, but we would tell you that even if you do believe that they expand choice, thousands of children are left behind in public schools. There's no choice offered to them. But furthermore, they say, by our logic, black colleges are segregationist. We disagree because these colleges aren't a systemic denial of education to others that drain money from the common schools. Rather, they're people building their own communities, which is not what we see in their system. Furthermore, on our second substantive, Josh literally doesn't touch it, but let's say a couple of reasons why it's important. First of all, we tell you students have no access to schools because there's no transportation. Second, we tell you wealthier families are more likely to get in because private schools can pick and choose them, and they're less likely to be able to research and apply to a bunch of charter schools. But now let's go on to our third substantive argument about how the school choice movement often erodes the quality of education. The first reason is because of the illusion of choice. We already told you how often charters are inaccessible. For example, look to Greenwich Charter in Pennsylvania. They have a one-day application period. You have to hand in your application by hard copy, and it's in a suburb that's inaccessible by public transport. Furthermore, thousands of children are left to languish on the wait list. That's not a choice. But furthermore, vouchers allow schools to literally pick and choose their students because it's a private school. As I already explained to you, that means that students that are white, students that are wealthy are often going to be picked. At that level, children who are left behind in public schools languish in a system that loses more and more money even though they still have the same overhead. But the second reason that the quality of education is eroded is because of harms to teachers. Often the school choice movement attacks unions, which are a right guaranteed by the National Labor Relations Act. This happens for a few reasons. Because they often have lower pay, lower job protections, longer hours, and decreased job security overall. That's why both private schools and charter schools have increased teacher turnover. For example, in New York City, charter school teachers are fired twice as often as their public school counterparts. At that level, not only do you undermine the rights of the teachers, but you deny those children a quality of education. But the third reason this occurs is because of eroding the quality of public education. We already told you how funding is diverted away from schools. For example, in Pittsburgh, charter schools demanded $53 million in reimbursement that got taken from the pockets of children in public schools. But furthermore, the cost of vouchers is greater than that of the cost of sending these children to public schools because you have increased administrative costs. The same is true when you build more and more charters. At that level, you see a couple of harms possible. First, schools are forced to close. Second, you cut programs. Or third, in some situations, property taxes in low-income neighborhoods have simply been increased. But another thing we see is that often these school choice movements advocate for school closure. In Philadelphia, we saw waves of public schools being closed as charter schools open. But furthermore, often politicians use this so they don't have to look at public school reform because they can simply say, we have school choice as an alternative, that way we never have to fix the public school system. And what this results in is worse education. Look to charter schools in Texas, for an example, where graduation rates are 35% lower than their public school counterparts and dropout rates are 16% higher. Or look what happened to students on the voucher program in Louisiana, who went from the 15th percentile of achievement for math to the 34th when they transferred, or for elementary school students, the 26th. Because the school choice movement stops progress in its tracks, we are proud to propose.
Thank you. Now we will have the second speaker for the opposition.
President Ronald Reagan once said, "The 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Sadly, we think that a team like Side Proposition with such an Orwellian fear of 1984 and Animal Farm can't somehow come up here and tell you that, well, government is the solution to a problem that government created. At the point where we say that Team Opposition is here to save students and not the system, we're proud to oppose today's motion. So here's what I'm going to do in today's debate. I'm going to first go over framing. I'm going to contextualize what the debate looks like. Then I'm going to go over their case. I'm going to show you why the substantive arguments that Side Proposition makes in today's debate just aren't true. And then I'm going to come back to our case. I'm going to defend our responses from basically what Ellie told you, and then finally I'm going to bring up our third substantive argument in today's debate, which is that the school choice movement protects civil rights by ensuring that we break down barriers in public education as well. But first, let's still look towards framing. We think that today's debate should be contextualized in what is essentially the school choice movement versus the public school education system as is the world right now. Here's why we need to look to a comparative. We think that in the absence of school choice, when you're asking the question, do school choice movements jeopardize civil rights, you have to ask yourself, what does a world without school choice look like? At that point, we think that the opposition's job is to defend a world with school choice working in conjunction with public education. We think that means voucher schools, charter schools, and public education. On the other hand, side proposition defends only public schools. With that in mind, let's go over to two key points of clarification and contextualization that Ellie makes in her last speech. We think the first one is essentially this point about for-profit, when Ellie tells you that the majority of charter or the majority of school choice programs are for-profit. We think, first of all, that's absolutely untrue in the case of charter schools, where 67% of charter schools are run in single-site schools. Here's the point. We think that those schools are the ones overwhelmingly started by community advocates. We think that those aren't ones where franchises come in, where they send management teams like Ellie would have you believe. Instead, we think that it's community advocates taking a stand, working on their school boards, and creating the innovation and curriculums that Josh proposes to you in the first opposition. I'll take your point in a second. But moreover, what we have to understand is the second point that Ellie makes, when she tells you that side proposition can defend a world in which the school choice movement distracts from reform. But here's the analysis that they miss, and it's the analysis that Josh provides you in the first substantive argument about the opposition, when he tells you that the public school system is hesitant to change and simply doesn't always acknowledge the needs of its most underrepresented students. At that point, we simply don't think that reform exists in their side of the house, but we'll show you how it exists in ours. But Nikhil, you seem to disagree.
So let's talk about reform. Charter schools have been around since the early 1990s. Where were your community advocates when turnover rates were increasing?
Okay, Nikhil. I'll get to turnover later. I'll actually show you why exactly your own statistics prove you wrong on turnover, but let's talk about reform. What we see in Arizona, for example, is that charter schools pioneer new and innovative curriculums, basically designed to address racially insensitive biases in pre-Civil War slavery history courses. And what we saw is that because charter schools pioneered them, state legislatures were more likely to adopt proven methods, and at that point, overall public education benefited because they created better curriculums. But now with that in mind, let's go into their three substantive arguments in today's debate. We essentially think that we agree that today's debate should be about inequality, about access, and about quality. Those are the goals of the civil rights movement that they proposed. Those are their three substantive arguments. And I'm going to show you why every single one of them shows why the school choice movement benefits the civil rights movement instead. First, let's go on to the point about inequality. Their only link here is basically that public money is being drawn out and given to students in private schools through vouchers or students in charter schools. We say that's actually a good thing, and the reason is because it creates competition. So here's what we see. Across the board, in Wisconsin, in Florida, in Maine, in Vermont, in Ohio, in Texas, we see that vouchers increase educational outcomes in public school. The only program that hasn't seen this benefit is DC. Why? Because the District of Columbia School District is the one that is compensated when students leave, giving them absolutely no incentive to change. At that point, and I'm going to get into this later, but we think competition creates an incentive that incentivizes public schools to do better for their most underrepresented students. But somehow, Colette, you think that's a bad thing.
If you want to help public schools out, you don't take all of their money away and tell them to compete. Instead,
Colette,
you invest
here's
in
the
everyone,
problem.
not the
Your status. You don't seem to understand. Reform never materializes in your side of the house at the point that state legislatures don't want to help public schools in underrepresented districts. It only materializes at our side of the house. But now let's talk about their second argument, access. Here's the problem. They agree that charter schools, for example, overwhelmingly represent minorities. Josh tells you that charter schools have to follow policies of accreditation. And Ellie says, well, they just shut down. We say that's the whole point. Because they're afraid of accreditation, because they're afraid of audits, because they don't want to get found out for basically racially gerrymandering districts, what they do is they shut down. At that point, we think that charter schools are afraid of the audits. They're afraid of regulation, and they're more likely as a whole to comply with it. Proposition can bring up as many random cherry-picked examples as they want, but insofar that we show you that the majority of charter schools overwhelmingly follow regulations, we simply don't think that their world holds true. But let's take them at their highest ground. In their highest ground, their world lifts absolutely no one up. our world at least has the chance at helping a few people. And that's what we think is the important point in today's debate. Because at the point where they give access to literally no one, but we give it to even a few people, we think our world is better. Let's look at quality. You have two links on this, discipline and teachers. First, their link about discipline. We think there's an inherent contradiction in their case because they don't seem to acknowledge that private schools funded by vouchers have far lower rates of expulsion. Somehow they only seem to think that charters are the centerpiece of school choice movements and that basically increases discipline across the board. But second, we think that not all charter schools are representative of this. And what Josh tells you is that the majority of charter schools have low suspension rates. Remember what Josh tells you in framing. We need to look to the majority of the school choice movement. And what we see is that broadly, the school choice movement decreases expulsion and decreases suspension. But now let's understand the third thing, which is that zero tolerance adopted in public school systems is far more dangerous because it increases severity, it increases arrest and incarceration rather than expulsion and suspension. And we think that's on net worse. Let's look at their point about teachers. Ellie said it herself. Teachers are fired. Teachers don't quit. Here's the point. If charter schools were worse for teachers, we'd see teachers quitting at higher rates. But the reason why teachers are fired at higher rates in charter schools rather than public schools is because charter schools don't have union regulations, allowing them to basically maintain that only the best teachers are helped, which means the quality of education significantly increases. With that in mind, let's go back to our case. And we think that there's this third argument that we need to bring up in today's debate, which is the quality of education. We think there are two levels of analysis under this. First, marketing and then modeling. And marketing is what I've already talked about. In terms of competition, we see that the high achievement of students in voucher-funded schools and charter programs coerces public schools to bolster achievement by providing specialized programs. At that point, we see that public schools overwhelmingly create better programs that reward achievement and support minorities. So the benefits in a charter school system spill over to those left behind, as Colette asked in the first POI to the first opposition. At the point where public school systems don't help everyone, but charter schools can even help a few people because of competition, we think it's better. Then we think about modeling. We see that public school systems are resistant to change, but charter schools pioneer innovative curriculums like we saw in Arizona. At that point, what we think happens is this. Charter schools provide a better education not only for their students, but for public education students in the long run. So let's ask ourselves, what are the worlds in today's debate? Their world. There's no chance of success, access, quality, or equality for anyone. But in our world, at least some people get it in the short run, and in the long run, overwhelmingly more people are benefited. That's why we're proud to oppose today's motion.
Thank you. Now we will have the third speaker for the government.
Aditya spends the latter part of his speech explaining to you how, in the long term, we're going to see all these amazing impacts and implications for students in charter schools. But let me tell something to the opposition. Some students don't have the privilege of sitting around and waiting until the long term to see these impacts. We shouldn't have to have generations of students locked into schools that are currently having funding taken away for them, just so at the off chance maybe one day we will see some incremental change. Maybe if Aditya hadn't waved down Nikhil's POI in the middle of his sentence, he would have engaged with the fact that teachers have been dropping out and have been fired disproportionately through all these years since charter schools have been around since the 90s. Where is the change that team opposition has been promising in today's debate? 3 questions in this speech. I'm going to ask, firstly, how does school choice relate with the idea of equity? Secondly, is school choice improvement for accessibility? And then finally, how does school choice improve the quality of education? But first, let me clarify something that has gone woefully mishandled on team opposition's side of the House. Aditya tells you, what does a world without school choice look like? We say, it looks like a world in where school boards aren't able to use their social location and their power to divert funding away from students in public schools in minority areas. We say, and this is what Ellie tells you, it looks like a world in which we invest in the public school system we have now and try try to improve the system now, as opposed to actually relegating these students into areas where school boards are lured into complacency and don't actually deal with their problems at hand. Today's debate, and Nikhil tells you this very clearly in his first speech, is not simply a juxtaposition between public schools versus school choice, but we have to ask ourselves, what happens to the educational civil rights movement as a holistic identity? That means we have to ask ourselves, what happens to the students in public schools who get left behind and ignored in their side of the house? Let's ask ourselves about the first question in today's debate, which is this idea of equity. And here's something that I find rather curious on Team Opposition's side of the house. Nikhil explains to you very carefully that the key aspect of school choice is the idea that they don't have these same regulations on them. That charter schools, for example, aren't held to the same standards that you would see a typical public school. So what does this mean? It means that they can skirt regulations and do things like pay their teachers disproportionately amounts of money and take it away from their students. It means that they can do things like request funding at almost any time and actually get it. That's why we see that when Beverly Hills charter schools were able to request more funding for their programs, we saw that taken away from schools in Oakland. Students in Oakland graduate 54% less than students in Beverly Hills, but because charter schools aren't held to these same standards, they get this money and they leave these students in the public school behind, and they don't have access to equitable education. Look, the point at which in Pittsburgh alone, $53 million was stolen from children in public schools at the hands of the school choice movement. We are saying that you are depriving those students of their rights and you are not actually allowing them to engage with that. Let's talk about vouchers now under this idea of equity. And here's what I find really, really funny. The idea that their response is the fact that we can just say, well, all students can just go to private schools if they have vouchers. Are you kidding me? A voucher is literally at max $4,000, a world in which most private schools cost $15,000, sometimes up to $40,000. You're telling me that students are going to be able to actually access that? And even if they can get a voucher, these private schools aren't actually allowed to give, are not actually required to give it to them. Look at the example of Campbell Hall Private School in Los Angeles, which in 2008 didn't have an endowment, so they suffered at the financial crisis. And at that point, they stopped giving financial aid at all. They still to this day really don't give financial aid because they're trying to get back from this financial crisis. But look at the analysis that Ellie gives you. She says that the students who are actually able to get vouchers are often the ones who are in positions of economic power already. So what you're doing is you're not actually helping the individuals who need it most. You're leaving those behind under the veneer of equity. Now let's talk about accessibility before I go on, Aditya.
Okay, so you still haven't basically addressed the fact that overwhelmingly across the board, we see that when you have vouchers, there is increased competition and increased achievement in public schools. Why is that true if you say all the money is going to students are succeeding?
I would have you know that the vast majority of public school systems right now have actually disallowed vouchers and opted out of that voucher system because they realize that it's not profitable enough for them. But what we tell you, and if you would engage with the fact that having a voucher, even if it's $4,000 and you're an individual living in abject poverty, that's not enough money to allow you to actually access the resources that come from getting a private school education. Accessibility. Once again, this is not gone responded with at all. And Nikhil and Ellie both tell you that if you actually can't get to the school in the first place to apply, we see that vouchers and we see charter schools are useless. We see that because of this unique lack of regulation, we see schools in New Orleans are underreporting slots that are available. We see how in Philadelphia, we see they have a one-day registration period that's in the middle of a rich white suburb that's not accessible by public transportation. We saw that in Los Angeles, in charter schools, when they tried to create a busing project to bring students in from Inglewood, white parents on school boards said that if you keep bringing these students in, we'll stop giving you funding. That's not actually an accessible way. That's how charter schools can use their economic power to coerce students out from coming from there. But here's what they say. Their only response to this is, you're somehow locking students into public schools. But what we tell you is that if we were to do things such as invest in the public school system, it would actually allow them to have more accessible rights. Aditya contradicts himself under this point of accessibility. He tells you that public schools and these charter schools are actually going to be able to be more accessible, but in the same breath, he tells you that they shut down at the fear of audits and somehow that's going to make them comply more with regulation. That makes absolutely no sense. Finally, let's talk about quality. Here's what we tell you, and here's something that has gone completely unengaged with. The point at which we tell you that minority students in charter schools and school choice schools are disproportionately expelled more because of their race, because of their ability. We tell you that this doesn't actually allow them to actually access this education. What we tell you is that many charter schools and many public schools, have repealed these zero tolerance policies, which are still held in positions by charter schools. What we tell you is that teachers in charter schools are fired 2 times more than in public schools. And we tell you that in Louisiana, students were actually seeing their scores dropping by 20 points in subjects like math and science. But what this does is when schools and charter schools are performing, it lures legislators into complacency. So they can point at the couple of good examples of charter schools and schools choice schools that are performing well and say, look, my system is working fine. We don't have to do anything to help students in underserved neighborhoods, because they can look at them and say that that's not necessary. The only final thing that they have on their side of the house is this idea of curriculum. But Ellie responds to this beautifully. One, we tell you that it's probably rather infantilizing to assume that public school people who are actually create them in their communities don't have the ability to develop their own curriculum. But secondly, we tell you that the way in which you allow public schools to develop their own curriculum is not siphoning $53 million away from them so you can line the pockets of investors and management in charter schools. But what we also tell you is this idea of management. We see that oftentimes, even if school boards have parents on them, those are the ones who are often in schools of wealthy status with predominantly white parents. We tell you that the ones that often get management sent in are students in underserving areas, and they're often told how to run their schools on their behalf. Listen, if you stand for students receiving an equitable education, if you stand for an accessible education, then you stand for the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we will have the third opposition speaker.
I genuinely wish we lived in a world where every single child could go to a beautiful public neighborhood school, one that would teach to their interests and tailor an education to fit their learning style, racial, and religious background. But that's not the world we live in. And we can't afford to sit around like the proposition and wait for that magical fantasy land to suddenly materialize, because you would think in the past century of education, it would have by now if that were the case. Because yes, all people are created equal, but not all people are created exactly the same, and we need an education system that reflects that and actually tailors educations to specific people we are incredibly proud to oppose. A couple of things in this speech. First, I'll be asking the question, what does school choice actually look like? Because there were a lot of misconceptions brought forth by the proposition that I'd really like to clear up. And the second question I'd like to ask is, does the school choice movement promote civil rights? Because fundamentally, that is what is at stake in today's debate. But first, what does the school choice movement actually look like? There were 5 major misconceptions brought forth by the proposition that I'd like to clear up really quickly. The first is this issue of access. Now, they claim that schools like charter schools just handpick the highest achieving students from these incredibly restrictive admissions pools and thus are better able to improve their test scores and make a huge profit. But if you look at what charter schools actually look like, that's just patently false, because most charter schools actually overwhelmingly serve underserved, low-income minority populations, and most of the students that enter charter schools, not only did they have low test scores when they were entering those programs, they actually had declining test scores. So those were the students who not only were not being served by the public schools, they were actually declining under the public school system. So this whole claim that charter schools are only selecting really high achieving students is just patently false. A lot of these charters were started by nonprofit institutions that actually tailor to that individual community and thus want to lift these low income, perhaps low achieving students in order to achieve a higher level of education. Also, with regards to the issue of these private schools not being accessible to low income students because the voucher doesn't cover all of the tuition, Liz brought up this really astounding number. She said that that the average cost of a private school is something like $15,000. Another blatantly false misconception. The average price of a private school is actually around $3,160. Not every single private school is a really, really competitive, expensive institution. Most of them are actually smaller and cheaper, and yes, these voucher programs, which are targeted at low-income students, can absolutely give them the opportunity to attend these schools and boost their educational outcomes. The second misconception that they brought up in this debate is the issue of quality. One of the only points of rebuttal that we saw for our direct case was this issue of the fact that in charter schools, the quality of education goes down because all of the money is funneled into management teams and all of the students are left behind and there's no money spent on them at all. That's just simply not true, because generally, when students transfer from a public school to a charter school, their test scores actually increase. So if all of the resources are going to management and nothing is going to students, then why are students in charter schools actually better off than those in public schools? Now, Aditya also brought up in his speech this issue of teacher turnover and how the reason for teacher turnover is because charter schools are actually able to get rid of the teachers that aren't serving their students' needs. This was completely ignored in the last proposition speech. There is a reason that that turnover exists. It's really important, and it is actually bettering the educational outcomes of students in charter schools. But I seem to hear dissent.
If anything, the reason why some charter schools are able to look better is because they're taking more funds for themselves, not for the management teams, but out of public school systems as a whole. That harms equity within the education system, an argument that you misconstrue.
Okay, what you want to do is sit around for the public school system to magically fix itself. We've been waiting for that to happen for centuries, and I don't think that waiting for it to happen for another century is the way to go about solving the problems with our education system. Yes, these management teams might be getting a little bit of money, but insofar as educational outcomes are improving for students who need it the most, we are incredibly proud to oppose. Now, the next misconception that we'd like to address is this issue of charter schools and school voucher systems sucking funding away from public education. All right, they continually bring up this example of Pittsburgh and how $53 million is leaving the public school system. The fact that enough students to provide $53 million are leaving the public school system is a testament to how it is not serving their needs. At the point where people are leaving the public school system in droves, we think that providing them with a better alternative is not wrong, it is the principally right thing to do. But now I'd like to move on to my second question. Does the school choice movement promote civil rights? And we would say yes. I'm going to frame this part of my speech in two sections, the short term and the long term. So in the short term, the proposition basically says that the students who leave public schools to go to a school of their choice, yeah, that's great for them, but they leave students behind in the public school system. There is no choice offered to them. But in the proposition world, there is no choice offered to anyone. An ESL student struggling in a public school that does not serve their interests is still ignored. Students of color sit in whitewashed history classrooms designed by school boards that empirically are generally run by white men that don't have these students' interests at heart. That is not serving their interest, and the very fact that so many people are leaving that system, one that does not serve them, is a testament to how much we need choice. We need an alternative for these students to a system that is not serving their needs. That is the way to promote educational civil rights, because an equal education does not look the same for every single person. We are all unique individuals, and the educational system that serves us needs to reflect that. Promoting educational civil rights isn't issuing a blanket statement that says everyone is created the same and we should have an educational system that just treats everyone like they are exactly the same. That is not the way to go about promoting educational civil rights, because as individuals, we are entitled to an individual education. And in this debate, only side opposition that actually offers school choice to students, only side opposition actually solves for that problem. But the second part of this question that I'd like to ask is, who promotes educational civil rights best in the long term? On side proposition, they want to wait around for some idealistic fantasy land where school boards that are incredibly slow to change magically overcome the immense political barriers that have prevented them from implementing reform for centuries. We don't think that that system is necessarily more predisposed to change than it was a century ago. Under the school choice movement, we've achieved more change than that broken system has achieved in the entire time that it has existed. We don't think that waiting around for magical sweeping reforms is the way to go about reforming the educational system. But as we brought up in our second speech, charter schools and voucher programs are. Aditya brought you the point of marketing, where public schools with voucher programs actually perform better because they are incentivized by that voucher program to provide an education that is of a higher standard. The same goes for charter schools. We also talked about the example of Arizona, where charter schools pioneered innovative developmental curriculums that were then implemented in public schools who otherwise wouldn't have changed because they didn't have this pre-existing model to base their programs on. We think that the best way to achieve both short-term and long-term change and promote educational civil rights is to promote the school choice movement. Thank you.
Thank you. That concluded the constructive speeches for each side. We now will have one speech to close each side. It is a 4-minute speech, and in this speech there are no POIs. We will first begin with the opposition reply.
Yesterday, we remembered the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his work on civil rights. Today, we remember that his work is yet unfinished. Education has been described as the final frontier of civil rights, and throughout the course of this round, it is not difficult to see why. But in the face of a public education system that doesn't address everyone's needs, the proposition team asks for us to wait for the system to fix itself, and the opposition team ensures that they have the freedom to choose a better education. We believe in saving the students who are the stakeholders in the system and not the system itself, and that is why we are so proud to oppose today's motion. In this speech, I'm going to be analyzing what occurred during this round through 3 questions of educational civil rights. First, which team best ensured equality of education? Second, which team best ensured quality of education? And finally, which team best ensured accessibility of education? With that in mind, let's move to the first question, which team best ensured equality of education? The answer here is the opposition team. Now, the proposition team's argument here boils down to one thing, that public money escapes because of the school choice movement. Now, I'm not going to get up here, and like my other speakers, they didn't get up here and lie and tell you that this doesn't happen. We acknowledge that this does happen. Public money moves with those students. However, we argue that this is a good thing, and the reason we tell you this is because that forces that the public education system improve itself. In fact, Aditya rattled off several examples of when this has actually happened. Texas, Maine, Wisconsin, Florida, Vermont, Ohio. All of those places, the public education system improved itself because they realized they now had to compete with the school choice movement that was granting students a better education. They recognized that these students were leaving because they wanted to, because they recognized that they were going to have their needs served better in a place that wasn't a public school, and therefore these public schools had to improve themselves. Furthermore, if they say that this money leaving is the true problem, then let's look to the example of DC that we provided you, where they actually get more money when students leave. If their argument is true, then DC's public schools should have improved. Unfortunately, they haven't. You see that when it comes to equality of education, we are actually better because we are giving them this freedom of choice. Let's move to the second question in today's round. Which team best provides a quality of education? They're going to get up here inevitably, like they've been saying, and say there are 3 things that are wrong with quality of education with the school choice movement. That the school choice movement drains public money, that it hurts these teachers, and that there are too many administrative costs. I've already pretty effectively refuted this idea of money leaving. When it comes to teachers, remember the arguments that we've provided you, that the reason that teachers aren't fired as much in public schools is because teacher unions wield significant power and ensure that teachers that aren't serving students' needs can never leave. We think it's actually good that teachers have to be actually serving the needs of their students because after all, the students are the stakeholders within that system. And when it comes to administrative costs, again, I'd like to remind Team Proposition that, for example, when it comes to charter schools, 67% of them are community-based nonprofits. But when it comes to quality of education, remember that we provide tailored curriculums. For example, English language learners benefit when they go to charter schools. And furthermore, we allow public schools to model innovative curriculums coming from the school choice movement. And finally, when it comes to accessibility of education, I think it all boils down to one argument. Take them at their highest ground that not everybody can have access to the benefits of a school choice movement and a better education. Even then, at least in the opposition world, some people can access a better education, and most of the time, it is those underprivileged populations that are overrepresented in aspects of the school choice movement. We think that when it comes to accessibility, it's a clear voter for the opposition. After we finish this debate, we will all walk through those doors into a public education system that is too often unable to serve the needs of underprivileged populations. And that is why I could not be prouder to conclude the debate on behalf of the team that would rather have communities across these United States chip away at the barriers of educational inequality rather than waiting for them to vanish.
And now to close the debate for the proposition and in the final speech, the proposition reply.
I think it's a little odd that Gaurav tells you educational civil rights is about getting equity, accessibility, and quality of education to everyone. But in reality, the only thing he does is only help the wealthy few while everybody else is drowned out by their white noise. That's what we see on the side of team opposition. So, a few things in this speech today. First, going over the framing of the round, then asking ourselves two questions. First, how are civil rights undermined by school choice on a principle level, and how are they undermined on a practical level? So going to the framing of the round, they try to tell you this debate should be about the comparison. But quite frankly, I don't think that's what the debate is about. The debate is about not how much they like charter schools and private schools. No, instead, it should be about how charter schools and school choice in general affects civil rights. But then moreover, it is not enough for them to talk only about kids that benefit from school choice. They have to also engage with the fact that millions of other kids are left behind to suffer. That's their obligation that they refuse to engage with. Then going to the principle level of the debate today, what they try to tell you as well, they create this idea of choice and this special curriculum that we're still a little bit confused about what this special curriculum actually even looks like, but we tell you no, your school choice, your special curriculum isn't always accessible. What we see with charter schools, they have impossible enrollment processes. They don't provide transportation, which is generally why usually it's wealthy people that go to charter schools. When you look at vouchers for private schools, it doesn't cover all of tuition. I'm sorry, Ella, but $2,000 is still a lot of money for a lot of people to pay every single year. This is why wealthy people are the ones that benefit from vouchers. It's not the low-income people that they say they're trying to help. No, these are the people that are left behind in public schools. So what we see here, this choice, this curriculum they talk about that's going to be so much better doesn't actually matter when people literally do not have access to it. But then moreover, the most important thing we tell you is that when you have school choice, you divert funding from public schools because the money goes with the student when they leave. This means that in the short term, public schools literally get worse because they don't have enough money, or they even shut down in some cases. But then moreover, they try to tell you, well, public schools can get better because now they have to compete. Quite frankly, I find this a little silly. How are public schools going to compete when they literally have their money being taken away from them? If you want our public education system to get better, then you probably should invest in it so that everybody can help, not just invest in the few amount of people. But then going to the practical level of debate, what we tell you on our side is that our government has an obligation to protect our rights, but school choice violates that for a few reasons. The first reason we tell you it harms access to public goods at the point where charter schools and private schools can skirt around regulations and standards. That's not helping That's not helping accessibility to public goods. That only benefits a few people, making it unaccessible to millions of others. But then moreover, we tell you it violates the rights of teachers by paying them less wages with higher hours, not allowing them to have unions. This is why they have more unexperienced teachers constantly circulating around the school, which means that no, this isn't better for the students like they tell you. It's actually even worse, more dismal for their education. We don't see how that's better on their side. But then lastly, we tell you it violates the rights to students at the point where you're 4 times more likely to be expelled in a charter or private school because of the color of your skin. That's a little problematic. That doesn't seem like it's catering to the needs of students. It only seems like it's hurting them. And we say this happens because these schools don't have to follow regulations that public schools are held to. So it only magnifies these problems. It only magnifies people's inherent racial bias. But then lastly, we tell you that these schools actually just set up students for failure because they don't have the same educational regulations like we see with less qualified teachers, which is why we see a decrease in scores by 20% in charter schools, and we see higher dropout rates for students that receive vouchers. So at the end of the day, yes, we understand that people like Sarah Jane Woodson Early, the first female African-American professor, and people like Martin Luther King might not be with here today, but the footprints that they have left behind, the path that they have paved for us are still here. It is not our job to cover it, but it is our job to continue that fight. Thank you.
Alrighty, excellent. Let's give one more hand. That was a very spirited round of debate. I'm glad that the 8 of you are out there representing our country and doing such a great job. So now I'm going to give our 2 judges here just a moment to collect their thoughts, and they're going to give a little bit of feedback and reveal their choices in just a second. But while they are doing that, our audience is going to get a chance to vote. I think we're going to pull this up over here. So if you have a cell phone, you get to vote. If you don't, sit next to somebody who does and maybe try to convince them that you are right and you can cast a vote together. But if you go to menti.com, and actually if you guys are up here, you can vote for yourselves if you want. That's the wonder of democracy, right? You get to cast a vote. Menti.com, if you pull it up on your device, it should say please enter a code. So I'm going to do this too. There we go, menti.com. It'll ask you to enter a code. There's a 6-digit code there. It's 271655. And there will be 2 choices there for you. It says prop and op, so the proposition side represented over here, which you heard from, the opposition side over here. So please take a moment to cast your vote, and we will reveal that in just a few minutes. I will maintain my status as a neutral party by not casting a vote until I get back to my seat. All right, so we'll give you just a minute to do that. Give our judges just one more minute to kind of collect their thoughts and any things they want to say. There's a lot to digest there. It looks like our judges are just about ready. So if we will start with our Chief Financial Officer, one who I'm sure was very interested in the arguments about the financial implications of school choice, given his profession. So we will turn it over to Mr. Jerry Zuck.
All right. Thank you, Tony. First of all, I'd like to congratulate all the speakers today. You did an excellent job. I am very impressed. I'm looking back at myself when I was your age, and there's no way I could do what you've done. So first of all, my hats are off to you all. You both sides had compelling arguments. I found myself flip-flopping, kind of like a mackerel back and forth. But at the end of the debates, I came out on the side of the opposition. And I did for a few reasons. First of all, I was convinced that we really can't wait for the system to change. The system does need to be improved, and I felt strongly that the use of the charter schools and the vouchers, I felt that that was really important, giving individuals the right to choose, because I did buy into the argument that individual education for everyone, and I guess one of the examples that worked for me was the Washington D.C. Example, where they gave more money when students left, and the system wasn't improving in the public schools. And I really think that the use of the charter schools is a good tool to kind of keep the public schools, shall we say, honest, in the sense that they're going to see more things being attracted there. The other thing is, I didn't always view it as sort of a for-profit. The chartered schools, a lot of them are kind of within the communities, and I saw that more. Yes, there are schools that are for-profit, but there are so many more that the communities are looking to change, and that's why they introduced the charter schools. And the view about teachers leaving back and forth, I think that's a good thing from a competitive spirit. I wish that the same thing could happen in the public schools. So those are my comments. You all did an excellent job. I couldn't be any more prouder of our future with individuals like you. So thank you very much.
I would also like to congratulate all of you. You did an exceptional job in making your points, both for the proposition and the opposition. I am astounded at how eloquent you are at your young age, and just look forward. I wish I could track all 8 of you through your careers for the next 40 years, because it's absolutely possible that we are looking at future leaders of our government here today at the Ronald Reagan Library. And I couldn't be more proud of all of you. My vote was for the proposition. And the reason for that is really not one specific thing. And I think that all of us in this room, especially those of us that have had some life experience and some experience in our career, that acts as a filter in what you young people said today to us. And as a person who's dedicated my life to public education, I think that it's only reasonable that my filter would be different than my esteemed colleague sitting next to me. I was very much impressed with Nikhil's, one of his initial statements of education is a right for all. There were several times that the opposition spoke about the fact that there are opportunities for at-risk and students living in the poverty level to access charter schools and private schools through voucher systems. But even in your own statements, you use the word some, not all. And so I was impressed with education as a right for all. And also, Josh, you made the statement that the change in public schools are followed by the changes in charter schools. And I will just say that my experience in public schools, and granted those have been exclusively here in Southern California, but I have friends and colleagues across the nation. I just attended a National Blue Ribbon celebration in Washington, D.C. I was actually there on Election Day, where public schools were honored for their innovation. And I didn't hear any of those schools mentioning that they got their ideas from charter schools. And I guess that what I would like to have seen from the opposition was a little more data and research to back up those statements. At the very end, I want to make sure I get Colette. You mentioned that we hear about those innovative changes and that curriculum, but It would have been nice to hear some more specifics about that that's coming out of charter schools. And then also the comment that was made about the fact that we need to invest in public education. We need to advocate for public education. If we want public education to be better, we can't be siphoning money off of education. It takes people that are committed to make our public schools better, but you have to pay them. And you have to put resources into new curriculum and new programs. And there's only so much money in the pot. And of course, based on changes in state and federal legislation, bills that are passed, that amount of money in the pot can change. So it's difficult, especially in the public sector, when you're dependent on how much money that's coming into that pot changes, whether or not you can sustain those programs, develop new programs. And so I do think that overall, my decision to vote for the proposition is based on the fact that not only do I believe that education is a right for all, not just some that take advantage of a voucher system or that have availability to it, but also that we need to invest and advocate for our public schools. Thank you so much, all of you.
All right, so we are now at a 1-1 vote, which makes this next bit all the more dramatic. How many total votes were cast? I think it cuts it off. How many total votes? 123. So we're not going to get a tie this time unless somebody split their vote. So with that, we're going to show the results here and see the winner is team opposition. So congratulations to both of our teams here today. Excellent job, team proposition, excellent job, team opposition, congratulations. And with that, we thank you all for coming today, for investing your day, listening to some really talented debaters, and have a great rest of your day. Congratulations.